Welcome to the Deep Dive, the only place where we trade superficial summaries for total immersion.
And today we are going deep.
We really are. We're not just skimming the surface of history. We're strapping on our oxygen tanks and plunging into a vast, complex, and sometimes devastating historical journey, the complete chronological history of Brazil.
That journey demands detail. We're starting over 11,000 years ago and running right up to the modern, often polarized republic. Our mission today is to give you a shortcut to true understanding.
A real understanding.
Yes. We want to connect the deepest ancient roots, the colonial trauma, the anomaly of the empire, and the cycles of dictatorship that all converge to shape the massive nation we observe today. We need texture, not just dates.
And before we even hit the year 1500, we have to talk about the name itself. The word Brazil offers a fantastic etymological detour that instantly defines the nature of the European engagement with the land.
Absolutely. The name Brazil almost certainly comes from pau-brasil, or Brazilwood. And this wasn't just any timber. It was a foundational commodity. It was highly prized by the nascent European textile industry because it produced a gorgeous, saturated, deep red dye.
So the history of Brazil, right from its name, is rooted in commerce and color.
Precisely. In Portuguese, Brazil is commonly given the etymology red like an ember, formed from the word brasa, meaning ember, and a suffix.
Red like an ember, that's poetic.
It is, but it's also deeply commercial. This highly valued timber was, critically, the very first product commercially exploited by European traders on the coast. Indigenous peoples, primarily of the Tupi language group, harvested massive amounts of it throughout the 16th century.
And they were trading it for what?
For European manufactured goods, iron tools, textiles, things they couldn't produce themselves.
So the foundational relationship between Europeans and the land was defined by resource extraction, executed via indigenous labor right from the very first interaction. That sets a crucial and tragic expectation for our dive.
It does. Our narrative will move strictly chronologically, but we absolutely cannot treat these eras as isolated islands. We'll trace a continuous thread,
right,
from the often overlooked pre-Carboline civilizations that shatter the empty continent myth, through the 300 years of colonization built on brutal labor systems,
the unique period of the empire,
the transformative and disruptive Vargas dictatorships, and finally, the incredibly complex and hyper-polarized contemporary era struggling to reconcile its past. So let's start with the deepest roots.
Let's do it. When we talk about Brazil's deep history, we immediately shatter that old European myth of a new world.
Oh, completely.
Human habitation in this area goes back millennia, challenging the whole linear story of how the Americas were populated.
And the evidence is stunning and continuous. Some of the oldest human remains found anywhere in the Americas, known chillingly as the Luzia woman, were excavated in Minas Gerais.
Luzia woman.
And this finding provides clear evidence of human life dating back at least 11,000 years.
11,000 years.
Exactly. This immediately places Brazil not as an afterthought in American history, but right at the beginning of the peopling of the continents.
This isn't just about ancient bones, though, is it? I mean, if that weren't enough to challenge the narrative of simple, transient cultures, you just have to look at the archaeological records coming out of the Amazon basin.
What's truly fascinating here is the evidence of advanced technology. Think about the skill required to work clay. The earliest known pottery found in the entire Western Hemisphere was discovered near Santarém in the Amazon basin.
The earliest in the whole hemisphere.
The entire Western Hemisphere. It's been radiocarbon dated to over 8,000 years ago, around 6,000 BC.
Wow.
That means sophisticated craftwork existed in the Amazon before many known civilizations were established elsewhere in the world. It suggests advanced, complex, prehistoric cultures thrived there for millennia.
So the key takeaway here is that Brazil was never an empty continent waiting to be discovered, correct? It was a place of deep technological sophistication.
Precisely. And these sophisticated cultures weren't isolated anomalies. They were huge, organized, and capable of massive civil engineering.
That brings us to the Marajoara culture.
The Marajoara culture. It flourished on Marechal Island, right in the Amazon River Delta, roughly from AD 400 to 1400.
Okay, so a 1,000-year civilization.
At least. And archaeologists have found clear evidence of sophisticated, elaborately painted and incised pottery, often featuring geometric designs or stylized representations of plants and animals. But crucially, they also engaged in immense mound building.
These weren't just small hills.
Oh no. These were large, purposeful earthworks suggesting large, well-populated and settled communities. This evidence points directly to social stratification and complex social formations we call chiefdoms.
Which directly contradicts the European perception, right? The one that persisted for centuries, that the Amazon was an empty, hostile wilderness incapable of supporting large populations.
Absolutely. Modern archaeology has repeatedly contradicted that simplistic European notion. New findings suggest millions of people actually lived in the Amazon in massive, organized civilizations.
Millions.
We're talking about what must have been huge cities, sometimes connected by elaborate road networks, and employing astonishing technological advances in environmental management. They created the famous terra preta.
The dark earth.
Dark earth, exactly. A highly fertile soil created purposefully through careful waste management, which allowed for intensive, sustainable agriculture in otherwise poor rainforest soil.
So their monuments weren't stone cities like the Inca, but the pathways etched into the land and the managed forest itself.
That's a great way to put it. They practiced forest farming, cultivating crops like manioc, and managing orchards of palms and fruit-bearing trees. These were incredibly sustainable systems that reflected a deep, inherited, and sophisticated understanding of ecological balance. The population density was far greater than previously imagined.
This level of sophistication makes the tragedy of European arrival even more profound. I mean, it wasn't just conquering an empty land, it was destroying already established, vast, and nuanced societies.
It was a demographic collapse on an unimaginable scale. At the time Pedro Alvarez Cabral arrived in 1500, it's estimated that roughly 5 million indigenous people lived in Brazil,
5 million.
speaking more than 1,200 unique languages.
1,200 languages.
Within a few centuries of colonization, due to disease, enslavement, and targeted violence, what amounted to systematic genocide, this population was reduced tragically to approximately 800,000 people.
That is an immense, devastating, and irreversible collapse of culture and knowledge.
It is, and the effects linger today, both culturally and politically. While the population has rebounded somewhat, with more than 1.5 million indigenous people living in Brazil now.
Which is still a fraction of what it was.
A small fraction. And they are still struggling for land demarcation and rights, fighting to protect their territories, particularly in the Amazon. Out of those 1,200 original languages, only about 270 have survived to this day. The scale of the loss is just staggering.
To complete this prehistory picture, can we quickly establish how these first Americans even arrived? Just to set the stage.
Certainly. The current widely accepted understanding is that the majority of native tribes in Brazil are descended from the first wave of Siberian migrants.
Across the land bridge.
We crossed the Bering Land Bridge, Beringia, at the end of the last ice age. This crossing occurred between 13,000 and 17,000 years ago, during a period when the planet was cooler and the formation of large glaciers caused sea levels to drop significantly, exposing that land bridge.
Connecting Siberia and Alaska.
Exactly. It was a massive, slow migration south, eventually reaching the far southern tip and, of course, the Amazon basin, thousands of years before the Portuguese arrived.
Okay, so fast forward to 1500 and the arrival of the Portuguese. We mentioned Pedro Alvarez Cabral landed on April 27, 1500. This wasn't a mission of discovery in the modern sense, was it?
Not really. He was leading an armada heading for India, sponsored by the Kingdom of Portugal and the Catholic Church, simply confirming Portuguese claims under the Treaty of Tordesillas.
And Portugal was not new to colonization.
No, they had recent, profitable experience that shaped their approach to Brazil. They had colonized islands off West Africa, notably São Tomé and Príncipe, some 80 years earlier.
So they had a playbook.
They had a playbook, and that experience shifted their focus away from a pure crusading and looting mentality toward a more calculated trade-centric model based on economic viability. This required initial communication and cooperation with the indigenous people for the Brazilwood trade.
And that initial cooperation depended heavily on cultural interpreters.
Indeed. Key early European figures were often those who had already integrated or, been shipwrecked. João Ramalho, for example, lived among the Guaianás tribe near what is now São Paulo. Diogo Alvares Correa, known by the indigenous name Caramuru.
Man of fire.
Man of fire, exactly. He lived among the Tupinamba near Salvador. These men were vital as interpreters and intermediaries, allowing the Portuguese to establish initial, albeit exploitative, trading relations.
However, the lucrative Brazilwood trade quickly attracted others, I'm guessing the French.
The French. When they began exploiting the resource, Portugal had to transition from trade to military possession.
That's the pivot point.
That's it. The Portuguese crown realized that other nations were undermining their claims, so they moved from passive monitoring to active territorial control. In 1530, they sent a major expedition led by Martim Afonso de Sousa.
And his orders were clear.
Non-negotiable. Patrol the coast, expel the French interlopers, and establish the first lasting colonial villages. He successfully founded São Vicente that year.
And the political and religious infrastructure followed rapidly.
In 1549, Tomé de Sousa established a central government in Salvador, the first capital. He brought with him the first group of Jesuit priests.
And the Jesuits immediately set up missions.
They did, aiming to convert the natives to Catholicism. But, more strategically, they actively sought to dominate and suppress native culture and way of living.
So it was cultural warfare.
Absolutely. They would congregate indigenous peoples into controlled villages called aldeias. This helped the Portuguese solidify their territorial control and cultural dominance. Despite this, the French were persistent. They established France Equinoxial in present-day Saint Louis in 1612, only to be forcibly expelled a few years later.
Now, early searches for mineral wealth failed, but the colonists quickly pivoted to a dominant agricultural export economy.
Which inaugurated the Sugar Age.
The Sugar Age, lasting from around 1530 to 1700.
Roughly, yes. Since gold and silver were initially elusive, agricultural exports to Europe became the financial engine. And while tobacco and cotton were produced, sugar quickly became the dominant colonial product.
Especially in the Northeast.
Successfully implemented in São Vicente, but especially in the fertile northeast state of Pernambuco, making its owners extraordinarily rich.
But the sugar plantations required labor on a scale that defined the entire colonial project and really cemented Brazil's fate as a slave society.
Brazil became a slave society from its absolute beginning and on an unparalleled scale globally. The numbers are just sobering. An estimated 35% of all Africans captured and sold in the Atlantic slave trade were sent to Brazil.
35% of the entire trade.
Of the entire Atlantic trade. This system lasted longer than in any other country in the Americas.
And why were African slaves preferred from the colonists' cruel perspective?
Well, there were several deeply pragmatic reasons. Many came from agricultural societies and were already familiar with intensive cultivation. They often carried immunities to old-world diseases that ravaged the indigenous population.
Right, diseases the native populations had no defense against.
None. And because their origins were geographically inaccessible, they were perceived as less likely to flee successfully back to their homeland.
Yet, indigenous enslavement did not disappear, even with laws against it. The colonists were masters of finding loopholes, weren't they?
It was a horrific legalistic tragedy. King Sebastian Aya declared a law in 1570 proclaiming the liberty of Brazilian natives, partly out of recognition that epidemics had already decimated the coastal populations.
But there was a catch.
A massive, exploitable loophole. Enslavement was permitted in just wars against native groups who customarily attacked the Portuguese. This became the justification for a vicious internal slave trade.
Which led to the expeditions known as the Bandeiras.
Yes. Mixed-race explorers, known as Mamelucos, organized these brutal expeditions called Bandeiras, literally flags, into the inland sertões, the hinterlands.
And their real goal wasn't exploration.
Ostensibly, they were claiming territory for Portugal, but their main terrifying goal was capturing indigenous people to sell them into slavery, particularly after the Jesuit missions were raided. By 1580, as many as 40,000 natives may have been forcibly taken from the interior to toil as slaves.
Accelerating the depopulation of the interior.
Exactly.
The trauma of this system naturally provoked powerful resistance, and the most enduring form was the establishment of the Quilombos.
The Quilombos. These were communities formed by runaway slaves or those who never submitted to slavery.
And they weren't just hiding places.
No, not at all, despite what the Portuguese claimed. They often became established political, military, and economic entities. While the Portuguese viewed them as relying on theft and raiding, many Quilombos engaged in gold and diamond prospecting and even traded independently with white-controlled cities. They were operating as autonomous zones.
And the largest and most politically significant of these resistance movements was Palmares.
The Quilombo dos Palmares, located in today's Alagoas, was a profound statement of self-determination. At its height, it was a self-sustaining republic perhaps the size of Portugal itself.
The size of Portugal.
Housing tens of thousands of residents. It was governed by leaders like Ganga Zumba and later the legendary Zumbi. The Portuguese attempted to conquer it repeatedly until a massive army led by the Bandeirante Domingos Jorge Velho finally succeeded in destroying the central settlement in 1694.
Zumbi was captured, betrayed, and killed, and they made a terrifying example of him.
They did. Zumbi was captured and beheaded on November 20th, 1695. His head was publicly displayed in Recife's central square.
A deliberate act of psychological warfare.
Absolutely. It was against the enslaved population who believed Zumbi was immortal and a spiritual defender of the Quilombo. The date of his death, November 20th, remains a critical date of remembrance for Black Consciousness Day today.
Now let's pivot from agricultural wealth to the mineral boom, the gold cycle of the 18th century.
This discovery in the interior, in what became Minas Gerais general mines, was a lifeline for Portugal. Its economy was suffering after conflicts with Spain and the Netherlands.
And this triggered a massive gold rush.
A huge one, causing the colonial capital to essentially shift from the northeast, from sugar to the southeast, to mining.
But where did all that Brazilian gold actually go? Did Portugal become massively wealthy?
Portugal did receive immense wealth, but the long-term benefit was surprisingly limited.
How so?
Well, Portugal lacked an industrial economy capable of absorbing this sudden influx of capital. So they used the gold primarily to pay for industrialized goods, textiles, weapons imported from other European nations.
Especially England.
Especially England, to whom Portugal owed considerable money due to military alliances and trade imbalances. Domestically, some wealth was channeled into constructing magnificent Baroque buildings like the Grand Convent of Mafra.
So in essence, Brazil's gold helped finance the industrialization of Portugal's rivals.
That's a very accurate reading. It was a massive transfer of wealth that funded European industrial growth, not Portuguese self-sufficiency.
And it wasn't just gold.
Not just gold. Diamond deposits were found near the village of Tijuco, now Diamantina, around 1729. This led to a rush so intense the crown intervened, eventually retaining an absolute monopoly over diamond extraction after 1771 to control the volatile market.
The overall effect of this gold and diamond mining was a significant shift in the colonial economy's center of gravity.
Profoundly so. It stimulated regional growth. It led to the rapid development of commerce and the growth of powerful merchant and middle-class communities in the newly important port cities like Rio de Janeiro, which became the colonial capital in 1763.
So this internal economic complexity was building a proto-nation.
Exactly. It was becoming too large, too economically diverse, and too self-aware to remain a mere colony defined only by its relationship to Lisbon.
Which brings us to the next, truly unique phase. The transition from colony to kingdom and eventually empire was utterly unique in the Americas. It was largely defined by the arrival of the monarchy itself in 1808.
It was one of the most consequential and, frankly, bizarre events in early modern history. The Portuguese court, led by King John VI, fled Napoleon's invasion during the Peninsular War.
The entire government apparatus.
The entire thing, nobles, judges, priests, artists, their families, about 15,000 people in total, along with the entire royal library and treasury, was loaded onto ships and moved across the Atlantic to Rio de Janeiro, escorted by British men of war.
Imagine the culture shock. Transferring a sophisticated European capital to a bustling yet provincial tropical city like Rio.
It was revolutionary. Rio de Janeiro transformed overnight from a peripheral outpost into the heart of a transatlantic empire. New institutions had to be created immediately. A royal library, a military academy, a printing press, a national bank.
And one of John VI's first acts was foundational for Brazil's future.
It was. He opened Brazilian ports to foreign ships, ending the restrictive Portuguese trade monopoly. This exposure to international commerce was crucial for fueling the growing confidence of the local elites.
And Brazil's status was formalized 7 years later.
In 1815, to solidify its status, King John VI elevated Brazil to the United Kingdom of Portugal, Brazil, and the Algarves. An unprecedented move. It made Brazil an equal kingdom, not a colony.
And when he finally returned to Portugal in 1821,
he left his son, Pedro, as regent. And Pedro, who had arrived as a child, had been educated in Brazil and was described as more Brazilian than Portuguese.
Which set the stage for the dramatic Declaration of Independence the very next year.
The Portuguese Cortes attempted to reassert control. They demanded Pedro's return to Lisbon, which amounted to voiding Brazil's elevated status.
Pushing it back into colonial dependency.
Exactly. So on September 7, 1822, reacting to this pressure, Prince Pedro declared independence with the legendary cry, "Independence or death," the cry of Ipiranga. He was soon crowned Emperor Pedro I.
But his reign was immediately marked by friction over the balance of power, wasn't it?
Immediately. Pedro was genuinely convinced that a strong, centralized emperor was absolutely necessary to prevent the violent fragmentation that was tearing apart Spanish America into numerous warring republics.
A fear that was probably justified at the time.
It was. But this belief led to immediate conflict with the liberal politicians. In November 1823, in what became known as the Night of Agony, Pedro first dissolved the Constituent Assembly by force. He then unilaterally promulgated the 1824 Constitution.
And this constitution contained a crucial, deeply controversial element known as the moderating power. Can you explain that?
The moderating power was essentially a fourth branch of government granted exclusively to the emperor. It sat above the executive, legislative, and judicial branches.
Giving him ultimate authority.
It allowed him to appoint senators for life, dissolve the Chamber of Deputies, veto legislation, basically to intervene to stabilize political crises. It was designed to ensure centralized national continuity, but to many liberals, it just represented royal tyranny.
Despite this powerful position, Pedro the Restless reign was short-lived.
His strong centralization, coupled with expensive conflicts like the disastrous Cisplatin War, which resulted in the loss of Uruguay, led to widespread opposition.
So he made a political calculation?
He did. Facing public unrest, he abdicated on April 7, 1831, in favor of his 5-year-old son, Pedro II. He left for Europe, ending Brazil's first reign and plunging the country into a chaotic political experiment, the Regency period.
A 5-year-old emperor. That means 9 years of turmoil, which severely tested the empire's unity.
The Regency period, from 1831 to 1840, was defined by political chaos and major regional revolts that absolutely exposed the fragile foundations of the empire. The instability was so profound it convinced many powerful elites that only a powerful, centralized monarch could restore order.
Let's talk about the severity of those revolts. They weren't just small protests.
Oh, they were near civil wars. The Cabanaju in Pará saw Portuguese people rising up, seizing power, demanding justice. The imperial repression was brutal, resulting in an estimated 30,000 deaths.
A quarter of the population.
Almost a quarter of Pará's population at the time. It was a class conflict layered with regional grievances.
And there was deep racial and religious fear associated with the Mala Revolt.
The Mali Revolt in Salvador was a serious uprising of enslaved and free Muslims of African descent. The elite saw this not just as a slave revolt, but as a dangerous, organized Islamic rebellion.
And the repression was swift.
Incredibly severe. It led to harsh restrictions, deportation of free Africans, new laws forbidding enslaved people from practicing Islam. The trauma of this revolt haunted the Brazilian elite for decades.
Meanwhile, the South had its own separatist issues.
That was the Farroupilha Revolution in Rio Grande do Sul. Powerful ranchers there revolted, demanding regional autonomy and protesting heavy central government taxes. For a decade, the empire was swinging violently between centralizing and federalist forces.
The chaos made the solution seem obvious to the elites.
It did. The national crisis paved the way for the young Pedro II to assume power early, a political move known as the majority coup.
The majority coup.
Yes. Exhausted by the instability, politicians orchestrated the declaration of Pedro II's majority prematurely. At age 14, in July 1840, he was asked if he wanted to assume full power, and he famously replied, "Quero já."
I want it now.
I want it now. And with that, the Regency ended, and Pedro II's nearly 50-year second reign began, bringing immediate stability.
And Pedro II was an intellectual anomaly on the global political stage. He was unlike any other monarch of his time.
A genuinely scholarly monarch who devoted himself to culture and sciences. His intellectual curiosity was boundless. He mastered around 14 languages, including Tupi and Hebrew, and maintained extensive correspondence with global figures like Louis Pasteur and Alexander Graham Bell.
Wait, so he was corresponding with Alexander Graham Bell and discussing thermodynamics while ruling an empire dependent on slave labor.
That's it. That is the central paradox of the Brazilian Empire.
A profound dissonance.
A sophisticated, modernizing intellectual monarchy built on an archaic and brutal labor system. His reign did see Brazil stabilize and project its power regionally, largely through military action.
And that military action was the massive, expensive Paraguayan War.
The Paraguayan War from 1864 to 1870 pitted Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay against Paraguay. It was a prolonged, bloody conflict that decimated the male population of Paraguay.
The most expensive in South American history.
It was. And while victorious, the human and economic cost for Brazil was immense. It made the Brazilian military increasingly professional, but it also caused Brazil to enter a long period of aversion to external military interventions. They really turned inward after that.
Internally, the economy pivoted decisively away from sugar and toward coffee, especially in the southeast.
Coffee was introduced around 1720, and by 1850, Brazil was supplying half the world's coffee supply. This major export crop, grown on vast plantations, particularly in the Paraíba Valley and later in São Paulo, fueled the national economy.
And even though the transatlantic slave trade was banned in the 1850s?
The internal slave economy actually boomed, transferring enslaved Africans and Afro-Brazilians from the declining sugar regions of the Northeast to the surging coffee regions of the Southeast.
The eventual road to abolition was slow, gradual, and ultimately politically destabilizing.
Legislation proceeded slowly. The Law of the Free Womb in 71, the Sexagenarian Law in 85. But the ground shifted radically in the late 1880s. A crucial final turning point came in 1887.
Why had it?
Military officers, led by Marshal Deodoro da Fonseca, declared that the army would no longer hunt escaped slaves. They asserted their role was to defend Brazil against foreign enemies, not to serve as the bloodhounds of slavery. Without military enforcement, the system just collapsed.
And the final act was delivered by the emperor's daughter, which proved to be a magnificent moral victory, but a political catastrophe.
Princess Isabel, acting as regent, signed the Lei Aurea, the Golden Law, on May 13, 1888. The law was famously brief and immediate.
It just abolished slavery.
It's just like that, freeing 700,000 people. But crucially, it provided absolutely no compensation or transition plan for the powerful slave owners. It was a moral triumph.
But it instantaneously destroyed the monarchy's political support among the influential planter class.
Exactly. The price of morality was the loss of the regime itself. The coffee barons and powerful landowners, who had lost immense capital investment overnight, felt profoundly betrayed.
And 18 months later,
Just 18 months later, Marshal Deodoro da Fonseca led a military coup on November 15, 1889, proclaiming the Republic. Pedro II, exhausted and refusing to cause bloodshed, chose exile rather than civil war.
reflecting that preference for managed transition over total societal upheaval we talked about.
It's a recurring theme.
Okay, so the newly proclaimed republic, often called the Old Republic, immediately replaced the emperor with a complex, often flawed system dominated by powerful regional oligarchs.
That's right. The Republic was initially dominated by the military, but it quickly settled into the political machine known as coffee with milk politics, or Política dos Governadores.
Coffee from São Paulo, milk from Minas Gerais.
Exactly. This was an electoral pact where these powerful oligarchies controlled elections by ensuring mutual support. They rotated power, effectively excluding all other states.
And this political arrangement reinforced the fundamental problem that Brazil was less a unified nation and more a collection of regional economic interests.
Absolutely. Brazil lacked a cohesive, integrated national economy. It was defined by regional economies that exported specialty products, coffee, rubber, cocoa to international markets. Real political and economic power resided almost entirely in the southeastern states.
Regional inequality was just hardwired into the political structure.
It was.
And following abolition, Brazil actively encouraged massive European and Asian immigration to fill the labor gap.
This demographic shift was critical for the modern identity of the South. Between 1875 and 1960, about 3 million Europeans and others immigrated to Brazil. Portuguese, Italians, Germans, Spanish, and a substantial number of Japanese.
All settling predominantly in the south and southeast.
Yes, and São Paulo in particular became an astonishing melting pot. By 1897, the city had twice as many Italians as native Brazilians.
Wow. And this immigration helped diversify the economy, but also further accentuated the regional differences.
It did. The early republic tried to project itself onto the world stage, culminating in its involvement in World War I.
Brazil entered the conflict late, in 1917.
Yes, primarily to project itself politically and protect its shipping lanes. The Brazilian Navy, supported by the British, escorted over 3,100 Allied merchant ships. But the war created profound economic disruption.
How so?
Well, trade partners, the UK and Germany, were affected, and critically, the British blockaded coffee imports, causing a sharp decline in export revenues, which was the main source of income for the federal government.
It sounds like the Republic's economic foundation, that reliance on a single export, was fatally brittle.
It was exposed dramatically by the collapse of 1930. The Great Depression led to a catastrophic crash in international coffee prices and consumption, ruining the powerful growers. This economic chaos primed the country for a political explosion.
And the final trigger was a fixed election.
The fixed 1930 presidential election, manipulated by the coffee and milk oligarchies, resulting in outrage from the Liberal Alliance, led by Getulio Vargas, the governor of Rio Grande do Sul.
And Vargas had powerful military backing from a group of politically radical young officers.
He was backed by a dissenting group known as the Tenentes, or lieutenants. Their philosophy, tenentism, was central to the revolution. These young officers were intensely nationalistic, despised the corruption of the oligarchic system, and advocated for political centralization,
Authoritarian in impulse.
but deeply moralizing and anti-corruption in motivation. Vargas used this military and political discontent to seize power in the Revolution of 1930.
And Vargas's subsequent era, from 1930 to 1945, fundamentally changed Brazil's political landscape, pioneering what we now recognize as classic Latin American populism.
Vargas was a political genius and a master of populism. He understood that with rapid industrialization, the growing urban working class and lower middle class were available for political mobilization.
He appealed directly to them.
Over the heads of the traditional elites. He even founded the Partido Trabalhista Brasileiro, the Brazilian Labor Party. But crucially, he largely ignored the rural poor, who often lacked the vote.
But his early years were marked by political violence.
He faced immediate internal challenges. The 1932 Constitutionalist Revolution, led by São Paulo, was a major conflict. Later, he suppressed both a communist revolution in 1935 and a fascist revolution in 1938.
And it was the perceived threat of domestic extremism that provided him with the perfect pretext for his own authoritarian turn.
That's it. That led to the Estado Novo.
The new state.
Yes. In a cynical move, Vargas used a fake communist document called the Cohen Plan as a pretext to launch his own coup on November 10, 1937. He dissolved Congress, abolished all political parties, and established the Estado Novo. He became a dictator with virtually unlimited powers until 1945.
A regime characterized by centralization and nationalism.
And economic modernization through state enterprises, laying the groundwork for giants like Petrobras and Vale, and the suppression of dissent through a secret police.
It was a dictatorship, yet it delivered significant social change.
That's the paradox. It was under the Estado Novo that Brazil saw the creation of its first comprehensive workers' rights package, minimum wage, regulated working hours, Social Security. This simultaneously mobilized the working class politically while tying their welfare directly to the state.
Despite his internal authoritarianism, Brazil aligned staunchly with the United States during World War II, a fascinating strategic choice for a dictator.
A masterstroke of foreign policy. Brazil was a critical U.S. ally, receiving over $100 million in Lend-Lease grants in return for air and naval bases.
And they sent troops.
Crucially, Brazil sent the Brazilian Expeditionary Force of 25,000 men to Europe. They trained and cooperated closely with the U.S. Army in the Italian campaign. This alliance helped modernize Brazil's military, but the democratic rhetoric of the Allied cause ultimately undermined Vargas's own domestic dictatorship, leading to his removal in 1945.
After Vargas's removal, Brazil entered a new era, the Populist Republic, from 1945 to 1964, which saw a massive expansion of democratic participation.
The 1945 elections were immensely transformative. Suffrage expanded dramatically from less than 10% to more than 30% of the adult population because the vote was extended to all literate men and women over 18, and it was made obligatory.
And Vargas didn't just disappear.
Not at all. He remained a dominant force, founding the PTB and successfully returning to the presidency in the 1950 elections.
This era produced memorable political figures, often defined by intense regional populism and political cynicism.
The quintessential example is Ademar de Barros in São Paulo. He projected a man-of-the-people image with an anti-elite message and was renowned for massive debt-fueled public works.
He was the one with the famous slogan,
Le rouba más fácil.
"He steals, but he gets things done."
That phrase just encapsulates a deep-seated cynicism in Brazilian politics. The electorate's willingness to tolerate corruption in exchange for tangible, visible results.
The 1950s also saw the most visionary, debt-fueled project in Brazilian history, the construction of Brasilia.
That was the vision of President Juscelino Kubitschek. His entire platform was 50 years of progress in 5. He wanted to spur development by radically shifting the capital from the coast to the central plateau.
An architectural and engineering marvel?
It was, designed by Oscar Niemeyer and Lucio Costa, but it was funded by massive external borrowing and printing money. This visionary project contributed significantly to the hyperinflationary cycle that would plague Brazil for decades.
By the early 1960s, political radicalization and that economic instability triggered a new institutional crisis.
Brazil had moved from automatic alignment with the USA to a more independent foreign policy. But Genio Quadros' abrupt resignation in 1961 triggered a constitutional crisis over his vice president, João Goulart,
Who was seen as a leftist.
a leftist and a nationalist. And Goulart's subsequent attempt at major social change led directly to the military coup of 1964.
He wanted to implement base reforms.
which included land reform and the nationalization of private enterprises. These were immediately branded as communist and revolutionary by conservatives, the church, and the economic elite.
And the military moved in?
With crucial logistical and political support from the U.S. government via Operation Brother Sam, they overthrew Goulart on April 1, 1964. This inaugurated 21 years of authoritarian rule.
And the military dictatorship's initial period, from 68 to 73, coincided with an extraordinary economic boom known as the Brazilian miracle.
The miracle saw the dictatorship enjoy a period of heightening popularity due to phenomenal economic growth, with the GDP growth rate averaging over 7%.
But this growth came at an immense human cost.
Huge cost. It was achieved under the iron fist of extreme state repression. Total censorship, confirmed torture and killings, widespread disappearances, and a reported genocide against 8,000 indigenous people who were considered obstacles to development.
It wasn't just physical repression. The cultural repression was systemic, wasn't it?
Absolutely. The regime employed institutionalized censorship against press, music, and theater. Musicians like Chico Buarque and Gilberto Gil had their work meticulously checked and often banned. Writers were forced into exile or silence.
But this economic growth, the miracle, was built on dangerously shaky foundations.
It was. It was a debt-fueled spending spree. The growth was financed by a debt growth strategy, massive short-term borrowing from international markets. Brazil's foreign debt ballooned staggeringly from $12.5 billion in 1973 to $43.5 billion in 1978.
They were borrowing to grow, assuming high global commodity prices would last forever.
And they didn't. The miracle ended abruptly, contributing to the lost decade across Latin America.
What caused the collapse?
Multiple external shocks. Chief among them was the petroleum crisis of the 1970s, which saw oil prices skyrocket, devastating Brazil's import-heavy economy. This, combined with collapses in commodity markets and sky-high interest rates, meant Brazil was crippled by its inability to service that massive debt.
The resultant economic privation triggered widespread social frustration.
Exactly. And that frustration translated directly into massive demands for democratic freedoms. The end of the 1970s saw a rise in organized resistance. In 1979, for example, some 3.2 million workers went on strike.
It was the combination of economic failure and social mobilization that forced the military's hand.
Ultimately, yes. The military began the process of political liberalization, or abertura.
The opening.
General Juan Batista Figueiredo, who took power in 1979, famously declared he would make Brazil a democracy, even if they don't want it. He began the gradual process. This included the passage of the amnesty law for political crimes.
The controversial law.
Very. Critics argued it served more to shield torturers than to heal society. But this process culminated in the first free elections for the legislature in '82, and finally the election of a civilian candidate in 1985, marking the formal end of the dictatorship.
So the return to civilian rule in 1985 ushered in the new republic, but the first task was immediately daunting, grappling with hyperinflation.
The challenge was existential. Tancredo Neves was elected president, but tragically died before taking office. His successor, José Sarney, inherited an economic nightmare. Hyperinflation during the early civilian governments reached terrifying rates of 25% per month.
Prices doubling every few months.
Insane. The government of Fernando Collor began major privatization programs of massive state-owned enterprises, Acesita, Embraer, Telebrás, Vale, a process designed to stabilize the economy, but often leading to accusations of corruption.
A huge moment for institutional governance was the writing of the new Constitution.
The 1988 Constitution was promulgated, establishing the comprehensive framework for modern Brazil. It was an ambitious, sweeping document aimed specifically at reducing regional and social inequalities. It dedicated 20% of the government budget to welfare.
And it established key checks on power.
Yes, including the creation of the Supreme Federal Tribunal, which has primary responsibility for safeguarding the Constitution. It was a constitution that explicitly tried to right the historical wrongs of exclusion.
But economic stability remained elusive until the mid-1990s, with a landmark policy shift.
That shift was the Plano Real, the Real Plan, implemented in 1994 by then Finance Minister Fernando Henrique Cardoso. The plan was brilliant, creating a new, stable currency, the Real, tied initially to the U.S. dollar.
And its success was immediate.
Profound. It successfully stabilized the economy and led directly to Cardoso's election and subsequent re-election. He continued privatization and free trade programs, integrating Brazil further into the global economy.
Despite this modernization and economic stability, the deep structural flaw in Brazilian society, income inequality, persisted.
It did. Brazil suffered from extraordinarily high income inequality that rivaled any country in the world. In the 1990s, more than 1 in 4 Brazilians continued to survive on less than $1 a day. The advancements were clearly benefiting only a limited segment of the population.
This inequality helped propel the Workers' Party, the PT, to power for the first time in 2002.
Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, a former metal worker and union leader, was elected in 2002, the first successful leftist president in Brazil's history. Despite immense investor fears, Lula shrewdly maintained Cardoso's fiscal austerity policies.
But at the same time,
He implemented significant revolutionary social programs like Fome Zero, Zero Hunger, and Bolsa Familia, a cash transfer program, and substantially increased the minimum wage.
Lula's government achieved significant poverty reduction, lifting millions into the middle class, but his administration was marred by persistent corruption accusations.
His first term faced a serious blow in 2005 with the Mensalão scandal, a scheme involving monthly payments to legislators for votes. While many thought his career was over, he managed to distance himself, highlight his successes in reducing poverty, and was successfully reelected in 2006.
The relative political stability of the early 21st century came to a violent end in the last decade, leading to significant modern instability.
Dilma Rousseff, Lula's chosen successor, was reelected in 2014, but halfway through her second term, she was impeached by Congress in August 2016. The charges were fueled by immense economic crises and widespread evidence of corruption. She was replaced by Vice President Michel Temer.
And this political instability was driven to a fever pitch by the sprawling anti-corruption investigations.
The Petrobras corruption scandal, known as the Car Wash investigation or Lava Jato, was unprecedented in its scope. It exposed a systemic, multi-party decay involving construction companies, politicians, and state enterprises. By 2017, the Supreme Court requested the investigation of 71 lawmakers and 9 ministers in Temer's cabinet.
Temer himself was accused.
He was. Lava Jato fundamentally eroded public trust in the entire political class.
This chaotic, polarized environment set the stage for the dramatic 2018 election.
Lula, despite the investigations, insisted he would run, framing the election as a confrontation between the elite and the people. He initially led polls. However, the subsequent election that brought Jair Bolsonaro to power was characterized by heightened political polarization and serious concerns about the role of platforms like WhatsApp in spreading massive amounts of disinformation.
Stepping back to the current economic status, where does Brazil stand on the global stage amidst this political turbulence?
It remains an economic powerhouse. It's a developing country with an upper-middle income mixed market economy, the largest in Latin America. It currently ranks as the 10th largest globally by nominal GDP.
And it's recovering from a recession.
Yes, after a significant recession starting in 2014, the economy has begun showing consistent, significant growth as of 2024. The financial capital is São Paulo, home to the B3, Latin America's largest stock exchange.
Despite these headline figures, income inequality and poverty remain endemic problems, frustrating the constitutional goal set in 1988.
That high income inequality remains the most severe structural problem. While poverty has decreased significantly since the Lula era, roughly 1/5 of Brazilians still live in poverty. This ongoing disparity underscores the complexity of managing an economy and society as vast and historically divided as Brazil's.
What an immense journey we have taken. From the 11,000-year-old history of the Lúcia woman and the sophisticated cultures of the Amazon,
Through the brutal extraction of the pau-brasil and the trauma of the slave-based sugar and gold cycles.
the anomaly of the empire, the centralizing populism of Vargas, the debt-fueled years of military rule, and into a fragile, hyperpolarized democracy, struggling with that foundational problem of inequality.
What's truly illuminating is the unique pattern of change in Brazilian history, especially when contrasted with its Spanish-American neighbors. Brazil repeatedly favored managed institutional transitions over total societal upheaval and revolutionary breaks.
We saw that time and again.
We did. With Pedro I's abdication, Pedro II's quiet exile rather than fighting the military coup, and the military regime's carefully managed abertura process. The transitions often occurred via institutional force or political compromise, designed to maintain the state's continuity.
But doesn't that institutional continuity often just mean that the powerful elite never truly pays a price for systemic injustices like slavery or entrenched economic control?
That is the essential tension. That continuity has always shielded the powerful from the full consequences of profound moral change. Which brings us back to the end of the empire.
Right.
The abolition of slavery via the Lei Áurea was a profound moral necessity. But because it was done without compensation or political transition planning, it became a political disaster that doomed the monarchy.
So as Brazil continues to mature and struggle, particularly with the 1988 Constitution's explicit objective to reduce regional and social inequalities, a goal that is still far from achieved, we have to ask the critical final question.
We have to consider what moral or political necessity today, if successfully achieved, might inadvertently create the next great political destabilization in Brazil.
A fascinating thought.
We know the monarchy collapsed when it chose morality over political pragmatism regarding slavery. Considering the massive political forces arrayed against addressing deep income and regional equity, what political price must Brazil be prepared to pay for achieving genuine economic equity across all its regions?
Knowing that the cost of profound moral change historically has been the collapse or radical transformation of the existing political order.
That tension between moral necessity and political price is a constant in Brazil's long history.